by McLaughlin College, the School of Public Policy and Administration, York Center for Public Policy and Law, Osgoode Hall Law School, the Department of Education, and the Center for Human Rights. I want to start by honoring and acknowledging the fact that we are gathered here today on the traditional territory of the Mississauga of the New Credit First Nation. The York community is committed to advancing the principles of social justice, respect, equity, diversity, and inclusion by creating opportunities to engage in critical conversations between our community members and with individuals who have dedicated their careers and passion to advancing the human rights principles of fundamental dignity and worth of each person in practices, procedures, policies, and laws, which in turn enhance our daily lives. Our keynote and panelists today are noble and dedicated leaders in the human rights community, and we are very honored and privileged to hear from them on this special World Day for Social Justice. First, right after I introduce all of our panelists, is our keynote Chief Commissioner Barbara Hall, who has more than 40 years of experience in human rights and social justice field as a community worker, lawyer, and municipal politician. She served 3 terms as Toronto City Councillor from 1985 and as Toronto's Mayor from 1994 to 1997. From 1998 to 2002, she headed the Canadian government's National Strategy on Community Safety and Crime Prevention and appointed Chief Commissioner of the Ontario Human Rights Commission in 2005. Ms. Hall also has practiced criminal law and family law and been a member of the Province of Ontario Health Ministry's Health Results Team and lectured nationally and internationally on urban and social issues. She has extensive experience on the not-profit boards and committees and has a strong record of bringing diverse groups together to build safe and strong communities. This is a small snapshot. There's a whole wiki entry on the accomplishments of Commissioner Hall, and I would encourage you to have a look at it. Following our keynote presentation, there'll be a panel discussion moderated by McLaughlin College Master David Leighton Brown. Joining him will be panelists Professor Brenda Spotton-Fasano from York University School of Public Policy and Administration and Department of Economics. Professor Spotton-Fasano is currently the inaugural director of the Transition Year program at York University, a university access program for non-traditional students, and director of the Access Community Capital Fund, a Toronto-wide microcredit fund. Her research project in community finance is exploring access to basic finance for low-income Canadians. And her previous leadership positions include the president of the Canadian Women Economists Network and chair of Senate York University. Sorry. Just be closer to the mic. I'm sorry. Do you want me to repeat? No. Professor Richard Fidd was born in Morant Bay, Jamaica, and as a young adult was a member of the Jamaican Public Service Agricultural Workers Centre. He moved to Canada at the young age of 21 and enrolled at the Sir George William University, where he completed a BA in Economics and Political Science. Professor Fidd furthered his studies with a graduate diploma in Public Administration and an MA in Public Administration, both from Carleton University. And upon completion, he continued his studies at Queen's University to pursue a PhD in Economic Policy Making. Horia Sultani completed her undergraduate degree in Political Science and International Development Studies. She was the president of the Poverty Eradication Project Student Association, as well as a researcher with the Human Rights Participatory Growth and Poverty Eradication Program, which was founded by Barbara's predecessor at the Commission, and this project lives on today, supported by McLaughlin College and the Center for Human Rights. And I expect we'll hear a little bit more about that project, or the very noble project from Horia. Her area of interests include international human rights, refugee rights, and sustainable development. Please join me in welcoming our esteemed colleagues, and I turn it over to Chief Commissioner Hall.
Thank you, Noel. Hello, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here, part of such a distinguished group. I'm always flustered when I get to York. I went to law school here, and for 3 years I was flustered. I lived downtown then as I do now. It was before the Spadina subway. The subway went to Finch, and there was the Red Rocket, which in those days was an old school bus painted red that left the Finch station every hour, usually with me running down the road after it, often missing it and being flustered until I settled down. But once I got here and settled down, it's always been a wonderful place to come and have discussions about important issues in our society. This is my last speech as Chief Commissioner of the Ontario Human Rights Commission. So I'm going to throw out the speech that I came with and talk a bit about the connections between the days that we're recognizing today, or the events that we're recognizing today. Black History Month and the UN World Day of Social Justice. 10 years ago, it was suggested to me that I might want to apply for the job of Chief Commissioner of the Ontario Human Rights Commission. And when that was first suggested to me, I wasn't sure that that was a good fit for me, because I never defined the work I did as human rights work. I defined it or described it as social justice work, and I wasn't totally clear about the overlap. I knew there was some overlap, but how much I'd be able to bring to it. And then when I started, I went first to the Commission's website and saw the kinds of issues that the Commission dealt with. I realized that my social justice work was indeed human rights work, and that most of the issues I'd spent my adult life working on were indeed human rights issues. For me personally, my involvement in those issues is very much related to Black history in Canada, but more broadly than in Canada. This year, this February, a lot of the seeing and watching that I've done in relation to Black history has been through the movies. I was very moved, engrossed in Lawrence Hill's book when it came out, the Book of Negroes, and very interested in how that would be made into a film. And so my family and I we're not big TV watchers, but we were there every Wednesday night watching the episodes. We even learned that we didn't need to watch it at the time it was on in the regular schedule, or something else. But very interesting, and I thought an important portrayal on national television of a part of the history of this country that is little known. A Black friend said to me that she and her husband had watched it every Wednesday night with their children, and for her it was very evocative of a similar experience she had as a teenager when the program Roots was on in America. That was a long time ago. That was probably 30 years ago when the story, a very personal story of slavery was shown to Americans. It's taken much longer to have that program, the story as set out in that story, shown in Canada. Made me think about what Barack Obama said before, in his first campaign for president, when he said, in America, there are a lot of difficult discussions that we as a society have to have. And racism and the history of the relationship between Black America and other America. Similarly, that's an important discussion that we need to have in this country about racism, about our real history, in order to understand fully where we come from and figure out how we go forward. So I saw Lawrence and Clement Vergo's film, an excellent piece of initiating that conversation more widely. It's also interesting because Lawrence's dad, Dan Hill, was one of the activists involved in getting a human rights code in Ontario more than 50 years ago. Ontario had the first human rights code and human rights commission in this country, in actually a fairly large part of the world. And Dan Hill and other activists are the reason we got it there. Quebec was many years later. We celebrated our 50th anniversary 6 years ago. I think Quebec is celebrating theirs the year after next. So it's interesting to see how Lawrence took his experience and seeing what his father and his mother, because it was the two of them who were activists in rights and in social justice, how he's used another vehicle to advance similar kinds of issues. Another film that I saw over the last bit was about America, but for me it had a profound impact, and that was Selma, the film about some of the civil rights struggles in the southern United States. I don't know how many of you have seen it, but there are many scenes in it of people in Alabama sitting watching the television. Actually, people across America. And not just America, because I was watching too on our maybe 10-inch black and white television in our living room in Victoria, BC. And I watched the students marching to be able to buy a milkshake at the 5 and 10 or the Woolworths or whatever the store was there. Or to be able to sit throughout the bus, the municipal bus, and I saw them marching. Gosh, they were orderly. I never marched that orderly or dressed as well as they were. They dressed like they were going to church, all there marching along peacefully. And I saw the dogs and the the police on horseback with whips and the water hoses attack those students. And seeing that on my black and white television changed my life. It converted me to social justice. And if those guys could march, then I could march. And in a sense, I've been marching ever since. It transformed me into an activist, and really almost everything I've done in my adult life has flown from that. As I said, I'm leaving my job. I'm 68. I'm stopping working full time, and people keep saying to me, so you're retiring now. So you're going to relax. Well, maybe a bit. Max, my husband, is leaving his job too, and he got touched by similar, he also in North Bay, Ontario, watched those programs, and we've both been working on these social justice issues ever since. What Selma did to move our history along was be one more motivator or giving of confidence to many in Ontario. People like Bromley Armstrong, people like Dan Hill, people like Hugh Burnett down in the Chatham area, who went to Europe as a soldier and came back and went to get, I don't know, I always think of it as a grilled cheese and a strawberry milkshake at the little cafe in his town, and they refused to see him, to serve him. And he wasn't prepared to take that, and he talked to his friends. And people like Bromley Armstrong and others involved in the labor movement organized. And they joined with another community that was experiencing very overt discrimination, the Jewish community. This was the days, about 50 years ago, when signs in windows in front of apartment buildings, in employment offices, said, no Jews, no blacks. Well, it didn't say no blacks. It probably said coloreds or maybe Negroes, or maybe worse than that. You could buy a house in areas not unlike this, where on the deed it said you could not sell your house to people of various objectionable groups. We're talking 50 years ago. I was 18 years old when that was part of the reality of life in Ontario. And if we look at Black history, again, and learn who the players are, we learn about people like Hugh Burnett and Bromley Armstrong and the work they did to demand and push the Ontario government to pass legislation to make that illegal. And they were effective. The legislation was passed. And that was a big, important thing to have happen. But they knew that having legislation is important. But that doesn't mean the work's done. That gives you a basis to use to get changes in behavior. The signs went down. They came out of the windows in most places. But the attitudes often remained. And so they worked hard and were leaders in the commission and other institutions in our province, being used to educate about the law and find ways to start to change the attitudes that required the law, and the combination of those things over time. It was the Jewish community and the Black community. And so the human rights protection primarily focused on discrimination based on race and on creed, which was the word that was used to include religion. And that was most of it. And that's partially because those were the communities, together with other people, other justice-seeking people and various faith groups and labor. That was the focus of the protection then. Governments don't go around handing out rights. It would be nice, but governments only give rights or protection when it's demanded. And many other communities learned from the success of those early Black human rights advocates. And so they started demanding as well. And today, there are 17 grounds of where there's protection under the code. The most recent was in 2012, when gender identity and gender expression was added to the code. And not so long before that, sexual orientation was added to the code. Disability was added to the code in the 70s after parents and people with disabilities and their friends and supporters and social justice seeking people demanded an amendment. So the pattern was set as to how to get protection, and then how to use protection as a vehicle to change behavior, and ultimately, someday, to change attitudes. An incredible model was set for all of us. Today, in talking about the UN World Day of Social Justice, one of the things that we read in the message from the UN is to focus on the eradication of poverty. People often say to me in public meetings, so is social or economic condition included in the code as a ground of protection? Well, no, it isn't. So maybe you want to scribble a note somewhere on your to-do list, looking back at the models of many other justice-seeking communities about looking at how protection is provided in the Human Rights Code in the same way it is for the other grounds. Now, the fact that it's not included in the code doesn't mean we don't do anything about it. There is, in fact, one poverty-related protection in the code, and that's in the area of housing and receipt of public assistance. That can be any kind of public assistance in terms of income. But it used to be, it was quite common for landlords to say, I don't rent to people on welfare. And so this provides protection in that situation, that if somebody can show that that's why they were denied the apartment, that constitutes discrimination under the code. But, so that's a direct remedy. In the other areas, we know that discrimination under the code is very linked to poverty. And so if we can eliminate the discrimination, then that will have an impact on poverty. So I think about issues where there are people making history today from the Black community, issues like racial profiling, something we know has an incredible impact on young Black men in this community, that has an impact on them and their life and the economic situation they're going to be in. If they're brought into the criminal justice system in that way, that's going to impact their ability to hold a job, to find a job, to get the qualifications they need to be financially successful. We know today that you need police record checks for virtually anything. I mean, if you want to volunteer at the public library, let alone get a job, you need that. And so things like racial profiling directly impacts people's likelihood of living in poverty. If the brothers and sisters of those people who are racially profiled and the community around them see that the criminal justice system is discriminating against them, that has an impact on their view of the world, on their view of themselves, on their view of their capacity to be successful, to stay in school, to do all of those things. So there are many ways that human rights issues and discrimination impacts social justice. So while people are getting it together to do the kind of work essential to have the explicit protection in the code, we'll continue to do the work we do at the Commission to reduce and ultimately, we hope, eliminate discrimination that contributes to poverty. And there are so many examples that I could give you, but we want to hear from the panel, so I'm going to close it. I guess I learned from history, from my community, but from many communities that make up this society, about the impact of injustice and about the possibilities of reversing, turning that injustice into real social justice. I think if we look at history, we see lots of examples of achievements and progress, but we also see many, many things that seriously impact on people's lives. So now, as I leave the Human Rights Commission, I'll have a bit more flexibility and travel a bit more and hang out with my grandkids a bit more. But if we're going to have the kind of community that the freed slaves or the still slaves who came to Nova Scotia and are shown to us in a fictionalized way on the Book of Negroes, then we all have to get involved in this struggle. if we want a culture of human rights in our province, then we all need to identify our ways of being part of the movement to change people. There are real new possibilities of things we can use in a positive way, and most of you know much more about those than me, things like social media and how we can use those things to reach people and to change behavior and ultimately attitudes, which is what we dream for, but behavior needs to happen first. Lots of people say, I don't care if he likes me or she likes me. I want them to stop putting up barriers and discriminating against me because of my age, because of my race, because of my sexual orientation or gender identity, because I have disabilities. Lots to do, lots to be inspired by, and I'm going to be there supporting you, because you, particularly those who are younger than me, have new ways and new energy, and I'm really looking forward to a new stage of my life, learning from you as we move the bar forward. Let's go do it. Thank you. You can look in people's eyes if you stand.
Thank you. Noelle, thank you so much for that generous introduction. And David, James, thank you so much for the invitation to participate on this day with this esteemed panel. I want to switch the focus just slightly, but pick up on a couple of themes, Barbara, that you had identified in your inspiring connections. I want to ask us to focus, yes, on Canada, yes, on social justice, and to imagine what it might look like if it were a little different with a little less poverty. But that's a big question. That's a big question. The challenge of addressing poverty in Canada is huge. And it's almost unmanageable. A lot of people have great ideas about what we might do with respect to income distribution and the like. What I'd like to do today is to focus on a couple of the very high costs of poverty in Canada, the very high cost of being poor in Canada, and drill down to something that's perhaps a little bit more specific in at least one case, and I have ideas about the second case, about how we might do things differently and where we might target our energies to improve the respect and to lower those costs of living in poverty in Canada. So really this high cost of poverty, I'm thinking cost both in terms of a sacrifice or a loss that one encounters, as well as the financial cost, the price that we have to pay. And I'm thinking here in terms of a loss of dignity, and how Canadians think about poor and poverty and people on low income in Canada. And I want to ask, how do poor people actually manage? If you're on a low income in Canada, how do you actually manage? What kind of choices does one have to make if they're living on an income that sits below the poverty line? So my first, so let's just look at the dignity for a minute. And the Salvation Army has done this wonderful, they've got a dignity project. They've done this wonderful study, they commissioned a study, to look at Canadian attitudes towards poverty. I was standing in line not that long ago, and two people in front of me were talking about, if you didn't have a job, well, that was your fault. You could go get one. And if someone didn't have a job, then of course they were just not working hard enough. And in fact, the Salvation Army Dignity Project survey confirms this kind of attitude. I was shocked. Apparently, 49% of us believe that people who really want to work can always find a job. 43% of us believe that a good work ethic is all you need to escape poverty. 41% believe that if you are receiving any form of income assistance or other assistance, that that person will just take advantage of it. And over 50%, 54% of us believe that a family of 4 can live on, comfortably, live on an income of less than $30,000 in Canada. Wow, this is like that's a recent study. So then I'm thinking, okay, income supports. Let's start with youth unemployment. Youth unemployment is around 14% in Canada. It's double the national average. So now granted, I'm going to take selective, anecdotes that just sort of, support my point. But they illustrate some of these perceptions. 14% of youth, double the national average, are unemployed. So what can we do about that? Well, what can I do about it? Hope to hire a few more with some research grants. But what nationally can we do about it? That's a tough question. Let's ask Steve Pulletz. He's the Bank of Canada governor, and he has actually got access to policy tools that will affect directly and indirectly unemployment in Canada. What does he say? To the youth in Canada, and you know where I'm going if you were following the news last November, he says, get some real life experience, even though you're discouraged, even if you have to give that experience for free. If your parents are letting you live in the basement, you might as well go out and do something for free to put that experience on your CV. So he's suggesting that all of the youth who are unemployed might improve their job prospects with voluntary unemployment. All right, well, that comes from a position of privilege, doesn't it? It comes from a position that says, I don't have to worry about earning an income, that I have the luxury of working for free and still meeting my minimum living requirements. Another solution that has been proposed nationally, and this on the government side by the feds, is to promote financial literacy. And there the argument is that especially for low-income seniors, especially for low-income youth, that the solution or one way in which to improve your situation is to reduce your debt. Another is to learn budgeting basics. So let's probe that. We're at university. We can use our critical thinking skills to ask that question. No, I don't. I just have to go out and ask a few people, well, what do you think about the government telling you that in order to improve your financial situation, all you have to do is reduce your debt? Okay, that irony was not lost on a lot of seniors who took exception to that advice when the Financial Literacy Commission proposed that one of the solutions to reducing low income, the incidence of low income for seniors was to look at managing their money better and reducing their debt. And in fact, Beverly Smith, I don't know who she is, but she submitted a response to the consultation She says it's like an affront if the ones giving the advice always operate in a deficit and debt, as the governments often do. It's insulting. Okay, how about this advice, this financial literacy advice that we should budget and manage our money better? There you go. All right, now, I bet, I haven't done it, but I bet if we took a survey of everybody living on an income of less than $20,000, that those folks would probably know the price of basics more than those of us who live on a higher income. How many of us living on a higher income know the price of milk? If you've had the privilege of working with anyone who's trying to budget on a low income, you'll know that they budget right down to the penny. Right down to the penny. And they're leaving after they pay for rent and they pay for all of the required costs. They're left with very little to eat on. Well, who is poor in Canada? So what does it mean to be poor in Canada? How much income do you need to be poor in Canada, to be classified as poor in Canada? The low-income cutoff, and these are for 2011, for one person was $23,000. You need $23,000 to hit the low-income cutoff. Below that, you are considered, in some sense, in Canada, we don't actually define poverty, you're in some sense living in poverty. You need $23,000 to live sort of a minimum basic lifestyle in Canada. And it goes up if you've got dependents. All right? So let's work with a single parent with one child, right? The low-income cutoff, estimated a couple of years ago, was $29,000. A woman raising one child on her own and relying on social assistance in Ontario could receive as little as $15,000. That is half of the low-income cutoff for her. All right, let's bring it back down to something that we know for an even greater number of our students, and that is the OSAP maximum. The OSAP maximum for a student in university with one or more dependents, after tuition is paid, is about $17,000. The Canadian Federation of Students is doing a study on the ability of our students to live on what is $7.50 a day for food. Try it. Minimum wage in Ontario, $10.25 an hour. And if that's what you were getting paid and working full time, you'd be making about just over $20,000. $9,000 short of the low-income cutoff. And then what are you going to do with your child? Who's going to pay for the child care? So working harder, so these perceptions, these attitudes about poverty and where it comes from and how you fix it, not only are they focused on the individual, you just have to do better, but working harder at the minimum wage is not going to eradicate poverty. It's not going to raise the individual out of a low-income situation. Working harder at home and raising young children is not the solution. And so that suggests that about half of us, half of Canadians, in terms of attitudes and perceptions, have a disabling, disrespectful myth about what it means to live in poverty in Canada. So I want to take you, and then who is poor in Canada? Aboriginal women are 4 times the national average. Visible minority women are about the same. Women with disabilities, 3 times the national average. Single-parent mothers are twice the national average. 7% of, or single-parent dads are less than the national average, considered poor. And single senior women are just under half of the national average. So there's something about that way, the way in which poverty is distributed in Canada, that says, no, it's not up to the individual. Our perceptions, those perceptions of 50% of us are just not borne out in the facts. So I want to take you, how are we doing for time? What did you want? Yeah. Thank you. I just want to take you through another scenario. The costs of managing your money if you're on a low income. Okay? So, how many folks know, how many Canadians know that if you default on your phone bill, that you are at risk of that phone company reporting that default to the credit rating agencies? And if they do, and that impairs your credit rating, you are unable to you will not be granted a credit card, for example. You cannot access loans. Okay. So the view is that people who are impatient, the people who don't have access to credit because, they defaulted on their phone bill or something, are really the only ones who are going to be accessing those payday loans that we think of as so incredibly expensive, and in fact they are. To access those quick, convenient loans for a 2-week period, they will charge you about $21 per $100 borrowed. That's that's an interest rate of almost 600% if you annualize it. Okay, that sounds pretty steep. That sounds like, let's get some basic budget information out there, some money management, financial literacy workshops going. That should improve the situation, because really, if you could get your credit rating improved and you could get a credit card costs you 20%. Their interest rates are about 20%. So if you took $100 for a 2-week period after a 3-week grace period, oh, okay. There's too many numbers, but I'm an economist. I like numbers. All right. The credit cards charge 20%. Minimum grace period in Canada is 21 days, 3 weeks. Okay? Before you start paying any interest on those charges, you have to have gone beyond the grace period on the credit card account. So, to make these numbers comparable, suppose you take $100 out on your credit card, you skip the grace period, borrow it for 2 weeks beyond the grace period, that's going to cost you $1.57. If you take the payday loan instead, it's going to cost you $21. No brainer, get the credit card. Maybe not. Suppose you don't have a credit card. For whatever reason, you don't have the credit card. What are your choices? Either it's a payday loan for 600% interest annualized, $21 on a $100 loan for 2 weeks. Okay? Or if you don't take out that $100 in a payday loan for 600%, you, for example, will have that check bounce for your bank. If that check bounces and you're charged your average $45 non-sufficient fund fee, $45 on a $100 check for 2 weeks is 1,400%. Suppose instead that $100 that you need from the payday loan company is to pay your utility bill. And if you don't pay that utility bill, they are not only going to charge you costs for not paying the account, but they're also going to turn off the utility and charge you a reconnection fee $46 in late and reconnection fees. $46 fees on a utility bill for $100 for 2 weeks is about 1,200%. The choice when you're living on a low income and you don't have access to the traditional high income credit opportunities means that the cost of managing your money, when your choices are pay the payday loan 600%, pay the utility company 1,200%, or pay the bank 1,400% in NSF funds fees, the no-brainer is not as the privileged are viewing it. Your choice is to take the payday loan. It is a wise choice when your other options are those that face many of our low-income students and low-income Canadians. So to conclude, my ideal of a socially just Canada in honor of the day that we are celebrating is a Canada that, with respect to those living on a low income, does less harm. It is one in which we will see the ease of obtaining a minimum income is at least equal to the ease of obtaining any high-income support. And I didn't go into, I had some shots of decision trees for how difficult it is to navigate low-income supports, where they are coming from different sources, they are contradictory. Those of you who have been navigating OSAP or any other low-income support from the province or from the feds know that there are contradictions everywhere. Some are automatic, some you have to apply for. It is a nightmare. You need a PhD just to figure it out. How about in a socially just Canada, we have a cost of obtaining credit that is the same for someone on low income as it is for someone on high income? How about we have a Canada where the choices under deprivation and scarcity are valued and perceived with respect, at least equal to the high income financial choices that those of us who have a constant income have the privilege to enjoy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I will try to make a few points on this issue today, and that is, I tried to combine, and I thought there was some rationale in putting the question of social justice and Black History Month together. At first I wondered what was the connection, but I tried at least. I guess I was trained as a public servant, so you have to make some kind of report. And therefore, the idea is that you find a way to make it, and so that at least policymakers can pretend to be able to do something. Now, the issue I saw as I look at these two themes is that I concluded that they're basically one of the same thing. And the basic idea is this, that they both represent deprivation of human values and justice. Because in effect, what we see in the case of designating a day of, say, international justice is some recognition on the part of an institution like the United Nations that there are these inequalities in the world and there's a need to do something about it. As a matter of fact, a part of the UN, UNESCO, made quite a lot of argument for quite some time about arresting the unevenness between economic and social problems. And because of that, it identified issues in terms of education, social justice, and things as a critical concern. Now, I'm basically arguing that, in essence, they failed. But one of the reasons why these things fail is something inherent in the value system in our society. Economic growth in itself is disparity. If you have growth, you're going to up and down. And how do I even know this? In my early years in studying, I decided to write something about development administration. Why? Because the basic idea, you wanted to improve the problems of development in developing areas. So why not have development? The basic assumption is that we can actually achieve it. Again, it turned out that we were not necessarily successful. And I want to follow this point through in terms of why this is perhaps an issue. Then I left that one and I said, well, let me look at depressed regions in developed countries. And in fact, I wrote a piece on the Department of Regional Economic Expansion. The evidence came in, again by economists, that it was a failure. Because in attempting to arrest regional disparities, you're in a sense negatively affecting growth. So that becomes, again, another problem. Now, if I tie this to blacks, two ways you can look at it. That economic development in North America, to the extent that it occurred, was done on the backs of the blacks. They basically provided labor for nothing. So if we're going to turn the coin later on, in terms of looking at what blacks have done, to turn around today and say, in effect, they're not making a contribution to society, is really an unfair way to look at it, because they've already paid the price. And in fact, as Dubois argued, these guys were turned off the farms and things like that with nothing. To begin to talk about income and whether they have anything to eat, decide to save or to spend or to adjust, the idea is that they're void of income. So we need to understand that original sort of problem. Then I also use a few examples. In the United States, the government declared a war on poverty. Simultaneously, they decided to put a man on the moon. They were able to put a man on the moon. It's technologically feasible. But why you couldn't solve poverty? The values are just not there. We do not have a commitment to actually do it. We say it, but in essence, we don't. And the records basically show this. As a matter of fact, I did my PhD thesis on the Economic Council of Canada, and it was one of the first institutions in this country to attempt to identify poverty as a problem. And in effect, it went nowhere, because there was a problem about defining that. So in essence, I'm arguing that these two things are directly related to the loss of human dignity and social justice. So in effect, if we're going to go about changing that, we need to change societal attitudes. Blacks cannot do it by themselves. Whites cannot do it by themselves. You need a dialogue in society. And of course, you must have an agreement on the social conditions if you're going to actually deal with that. So we need to reconstruct that sort of. In fact, I have a note here that a former chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, Arthur Kahn, discovered at some point that he had cancer and he was dying, and he wrote a fantastic essay, Equality and Efficiency, the Big Trade-off. And basically what he was really saying is that, yes, we want democracy. But one of the reasons why we can't have democracy, we don't have equality in income. And you can't basically have one, in essence, without the other. And by the way, in the discussion we were having earlier, the biggest contribution you can make to social justice is that people have a job. And that's why the United States and the UK, when the first thing after World War II is pass a Full Employment Act. And the idea of full employment is to raise the potential of society to have everybody fully employed. If you have people not fully employed, then the economy cannot be at its potential because you have underutilized resources. Now, second is the issue of social justice. And why we're concerned with it in terms of we're dealing with problems in terms of human responsibility, and dignity. And one of the problems we have here is that some people in society cannot speak for themselves. And one of the examples I make here, I was at a Political Science Association meeting in Windsor some years ago. Seymour Lipset was there as a guest. And everybody began discussing blacks and blacks' attitudes and beliefs. I was the only member of that group who was black. And the only thing I could say is to put my hand up, I wonder if I should say something. Because I recognized that there was no black voice, but everybody knew something about black. And they were, articulating. And of course, most of it had to do with the deficiencies, what essentially is wrong with these people. So one of the things that we can do is to change our attitudes about people and to ensure, and by the way, as an educated black, even getting a PhD or something like that, don't put you past the post, because you're still suspected. When you get around a table and people discussing competence, you still haven't got there yet, even though the records say you have attained what it requires to actually do that. And by the way, this is a big problem, why some people in the black race or the native people will not seek education, because they think it might lead to frustration, because they'll get to a point where you're a misfit. As a matter of fact, I should give you a little story here. When I was growing up in Jamaica, everybody that we saw that did not appear to went around talking certain things, you'd say they were mad. And in many respects, they were really misfits. We had a guy in my town who used to raise a problem. He'd go around U Blocks, U Store, and he was quoting Shakespeare. And he looked at an Englishman and he says, I bet you don't know who wrote that. And they send you here to rule us. And the basic idea is a sarcastic way of looking at this social structure problem, and in that sort of a context. Now, so in a way, these affected people must be able to speak for themselves. Now, and the third issue that I would make here too, that the blacks, in many respects, many of them, were not necessarily well educated. But you know what is ironic? They were able to say profound things about society that are not in scholarly books. Marcus Garvey, for example, articulated a problem of black business, black attitude, what have you. First of all, he was thrown out of the United States for that. And you have that kind of a problem because they were not able to speak for themselves, and it deprived these people of leadership. And to get blacks and people like that in better position in our society, they need to be linked back to their leaders so that they have role models to move forward in terms of where they need to go. And that's why I refer to people like Du Bois and Garvey in terms of people who attempted to address that kind of problem. The other thing that I also want to say is this, is that in many cases, the leaders were actually put in jail. Not only to say they were deprived of dignity, they were feared and literally put away, because in many respects, there were serious dangers about it seen in society that they could change the values of our society. And these are very interesting things. As a matter of fact, I grew up in Morant Bay in Jamaica, and one of the interesting things about Morant Bay is that there was something in 1865 called the Morant Bay Rebellion. And it was really a plantation uprising. People were asking for better wages and what have you. And in effect, what happened was that the people who led it were hung. And by the way, I was born just a couple hundred yards from where they were hung. So from a child, this is a story that you kept remembering, that these people were viewed as negative people. And they had offspring who tried to run for elections and so, and nobody paid them any mind, again, because they had done something terrible in terms of seeking social justice. So again, they are noble objectives, but they are not necessarily seen as good things that some people should aspire for. And these things need to be looked at. And the fifth point I want to make here is that at the University of the West Indies, I think later this year, they're going to have a conference on the Morant Bay Rebellion 150 years after. And the reason why they're having it, there are now different interpretations of the events. Because these people were viewed as doing something terrible. Now, by the way, those people are now declared national heroes in Jamaica. Because people have gone back, looked at the record, and realized that they were advanced thinkers. So the other thing we need to do is to identify people like black leaders, or, by the way, people, women and stuff like this in society that were not necessarily treated the best way that they should, and reassess that in terms of your responsibility, human rights, in terms of how do we treat human beings as being equal. And basically, I have just jotted down these few points. I realized I had just about 10 minutes, and I just thought I would do that just to encourage some discussion. Thank you.
Okay. Good. So I would like to first thank McLaughlin College for hosting this event and inviting me to take part. Thank you. In my presentation, my focus is going to be a bit different, and it's going to be talking about the role of students in achieving world justice and how the university environment can facilitate that. So I did my undergrad in political science and international development studies, and the nature of my studies involved a lot of dialogue around topics of social justice surrounding human rights, be it refugee rights, food security, and so forth. So it was given that on a regular basis I would be engaged in dialogue with professors and colleagues about how we have this complex international system that daily fosters global inequalities. This is the beauty of international development studies field. However, not everyone is in the same field, and not everyone gets the benefit of this. So we have around 50,000 students at York. It might be more, I'm not sure. But they're not involved in discussing critically and analytically about everything they do and how it impacts the entire world and topic of social justice. So just recently, in the spirit of Valentine, I was reading an article about the labor force behind flowers that we buy on Valentine's Day, especially given that this is the one day in the year where the sales of flowers rocket. I was astonished to find out about the systematic labor abuses that take place in preparing these flowers. I sort of was terrified because even though I come from an IDS background, I wasn't really familiar with this topic. So I decided to do a little experiment and talked to a few of my friends and sent the link to this article to see if they were aware of the situation. And surprise, surprise, they weren't. So what I'm trying to get at is what we need to do. So there are many student associations on campus at York that deal with discussing about social justice and raising awareness. And an example of that is the Poverty Eradication Student Club that I'm part of. Now, what we do is that we try to start dialogue and engage students in this dialogue about issues on environmental, social, human rights that exist locally and globally. And there are also some work options like the Human Rights Participatory Growth and the Poverty Eradication Project, which is located in McLaughlin. And the Poverty Eradication Student Club is sister of this organization. And these are great opportunities for students to get involved and meet other peers that have the same passion and discuss more about issues regarding social justice. Just to give a little example of activities we have done in the student club and research center is gleaning project. So the Human Rights Participatory Growth and the Poverty Eradication Project did a report on food security in Canada and how in regards to low-income individuals, how they don't have access to fresh produce. And when they go to food banks, the only food available are canned foods. And that's very important because that leads to health issues. And when you have health issues, that leads to not being able to make work full-time. And not being able to work full-time leads to poverty issues. So there's this cycle we saw. So what we propose is that let's do a gleaning project. And the Poverty Eradication Student Club took that project on and implemented. So we gathered a bunch of volunteers that were interested on this topic. We did a little discussion about it. We collaborated with a farm, and then we went there. We harvested some produce, and then we got in contact with some food banks that were in that area, and they came and picked it up. And unfortunately, you can't do this every day for all seasons. There's only a certain time you can do it, but it was a step that we took on, and we saw very good outcomes from it. So this is all great, and there are other clubs that also take on the focus of social justice, but what I want to try to get at is that not every student is aware of these issues that exist. Maybe the flower plantation or gleaning project that we have. And if I want to take an example, let's say we have a student that is in computer science, they're not in an environment that fosters them to think critically about how every action they take or what they buy has a human price to it. So what can be done? Now, I have a proposal, and I think this is something that maybe we can think about, and that this is where the university environment can come in and help foster the dialogue of having students engage in this dialogue of social justice. And that is, we need the university institution take part and provide in their classes an aspect of social responsibility. And this can be formatted in regards to their topics. So I'm going to go back to the example of a student who is in computer science. Now, in one of their classes, the professor is talking about their computer, maybe some programming aspects. I'm not too familiar with that, but my idea is the computer. And maybe they can bring up the question of, do you know what happens to your computer when you don't use it anymore? Where does it go? Then they lead to the topic of dumping. And where does the dumping happen? Does it happen in Canada? Does it happen in a third world country? What is the effect of that dumping? Right? So what can we do to maybe recycle our electronics, our computers, our phones better? So what I'm trying to get at is that we need to help create an environment where students can become familiar, understand the issues of human rights and human justice, social justice issues, and the knowledge is the first step in creating a feeling of empathy and motivate students to get involved and engage in activities that can lead and support to greater equality. So that's, thank you.
Thank you very much to every member of the panel. We only have a little bit of time, but we do have some time for questions and comments, which you could address to any individual or to the panel as a whole. If you have a question, I'd appreciate it if you would go to the microphone, because as you will have noticed, this session is being recorded and will be available on the college website subsequently, and you will only be heard asking your question if you're at the microphone. So please go to the microphone.
Just recently I read it's in the States, Governor Scott Walker, he came to a lot of controversy because one of the programs that he decided to do in the States was where people were applying for welfare. He basically made the rest of the people who wanted to receive it go through a drug test. So it was like a way of like trying to find a legal loophole to discriminate against people who want to receive government benefits, because they found out that the most of the people who would be denied it that way would be come from like particularly the African American community. So it shows that politicians in the modern day, like even though they can't legally like hurt one community, they can still find legal loopholes around it. They can still find legal ways to discriminate by like preventing certain people from getting welfare benefits. So, do you think like politicians in Canada are doing the same thing, or is it a phenomenon that's only in the United States?
I think that if that were to be proposed in Canada, it would be fought on a number of grounds. One being human rights grounds. Drug testing is a big issue. There are many employers who want to do drug testing, and the law is very clear that there has to be a very specific link between the use of drugs and the work that you're doing. So, I mean, it comes up often in mining and some lumbering, some construction sites in remote areas where a lot of high, big equipment is being used. It comes up with pilots areas. So I think that it would be impossible to come up with a legitimate reason beyond pure discrimination for such a requirement, and I don't think it would be successful here. I suspect it won't be successful there either, because ways would be, it would be challenged.
Even like some people on the right are against it because they think that like it costs a lot of money, so they think that there's no point in doing it because people on the right are against government spending any money. So even within his own camp, Scott Walker is kind of having a difficulty like selling his program to his own supporters.
Right. Lots of reasons why it would be unsuccessful.
Hello. First of all, I'd like to thank you for coming out on such a cold day. I found all your talks very interesting. I learned a lot, especially about your own personal experience with human rights. So my question is actually something that Barbara Hall mentioned. I was just, because you were talking about racial profiling and about how it affects getting jobs. So, but what if you were accused but not convicted? Would that still affect your ability of employment? Could it be, would that still be in the police record? Like if we were just accused and not convicted?
We've done a lot of work on police record checks and what information police gather, and then what they do with it. And it can come up in a lot of ways. Sometimes it's people being arrested and perhaps not charged, but the contact being in the record. It often comes up for people with mental health issues who may be taken by the police to a hospital under the Mental Health Act, which permits them to do that. So it has nothing to do with the criminal code, but it's a contact. And in the records, I think probably all of you have seen in the media some of the stories about people who either attempting to cross the border or to get jobs have been prevented because of information in police records. So I think all of those things have resulted in a real awareness. A lot of police services have voluntarily set up standards and guidelines for what information they'll collect, they'll hold. Much information, the mental health stuff, for example, that they won't release in standard security impacts. I saw in the paper in the last couple of days that the provincial government is going to come out with regulations related to what information police can gather and what they can do with it after they keep it. And the police know that's coming, and many of them are working on it themselves to just have convictions, things that are legitimate for them to have.
Right, thank you.
All right, so I just wanted to open up and say that you all did a fabulous job speaking. I'm sure a lot of people who came out were very impressed with the words that were shared. I had a specific question for Barbara Hall. I hope it's not too much spotlight for you. But I was reflecting on the speech that you gave. You gave a speech that was different from the one you planned, I think I remember you saying. And when you were talking about title deeds for houses and how colored people were excluded 50 years ago, it really resonated for me. And so I was wondering what your thoughts were on the direction the country's headed in terms of racism and equality.
I think that it's hard to say. I'm an optimist, and so I believe that there are many people committed to equality and social justice, in spite of the racism and inequity that exists. And I do see glimmers of light, and I meet and hear younger Canadians with different perspectives than who've had experiences quite different from those that I had in the times that I come along. As Professor Fidd said, you know, representation and democracy is really important, and I find that discouraging. I think about it in Toronto, and because I was involved in municipal politics there, I watched that pretty carefully. And the last two elections, there's been a really exciting group of quite young people from various diverse communities who've come out and run and been incredible dynamos and often been recognized. I mean, they've got endorsements from some mainstream media, and yet none of them have yet been successful. The good news is that they're not giving up and going away, and that they're continuing to, you know, build their strength and their skills. One of the things I want to do when I'm out of this job is support some of those candidates to see about, to help build some bridges that will make them successful. We can't continue to have city councils and provincial legislatures or parliaments in Canada that are so unrepresentative of the people who are elected. I think if we can change some of those things, then we have much more possibility. So I think politics is important. And if we look in history, if we look at the history of Black Ontarians and some of the changes that have been made, I think one of the things in my original speech that I didn't give was reference to Leonard Braithwaite, who was an MPP, one of the first black MPPs, and he really focused on, at one point in his career, on hiring at the Toronto Board of Education, and the need to hire teachers who represent the students and are knowledgeable about the experience and the real lived experience of the kids who are students there. So, I mean, we can see many examples of progress when people who live the experience they talk about. As a woman, that's been an issue for me since my youth, when there were many fewer women in leadership positions such as that. There's been some progress made there, not enough, but I think getting that kind of representation is really important. So I'm optimistic. I'll be there when you decide you're going to run. Call me up. I'm a damn good campaigner.
Thank you wholeheartedly, thank you.
Okay, we'll have time for these two last questions. Go ahead.
For others.
I had one too, I didn't think, I was going to understand. I thought that was optional. No, give me a turn. Wow.
Thank you very much. The lunch has gone to the stomach and the talk has gone to the brain. I'm grateful to the master for feeding my brain through the market of knowledge I learned from around. Allow me to define history as a telescopic instrument to see the past. I'm not sure the clarity of the telescope to see the past, because history has not been written as it was happening. As we can see now in the book of Nicholas, history is being rewritten. Now the question comes to us, what are we leaving for the generation to come? Are we preparing to give the generation to come to rewrite our history? Or we are writing history for the generation to come as it happens? How many of you know what happened in Paris 2 days ago? Chelsea, right? No. Thank you, Master. I'm not sure about history, whether it has been written clearly. Now, my question is clear. What is our strategy to leave for the generation to come? What is happening exactly now? At the micro level, at the macro level, locally, provincially, federally, and globally. Are we doing our role of our time? This generation should be full of questions. By the way, Barbara, I'm 1 year younger than you. And at the age of 62, I graduated my second degree, my master's degree, from the United Nations University for Peace, Costa Rica. Now I am here to serve my country of choice, Canada. Are you asking yourself, as I am asking myself, what are this young generation what are we leaving behind us? Actually, it's not a question, it is a view. Let's ask ourselves, what can we do for the country we have chosen to come? Never go back, but build here a culture of peace for the generation to come. Thank you.
I'm not going to talk about age by no means, because I'll be kicked out of here, I'm minor. But I'm going to read a poem which is not mine, and I'm sure that all of you will understand. It says, بنی آدم اعضای یکدیگرند که در آفرینش ز یک گوهر چو عضوی به درد آورد روزگار دیگر عضوها را نماند تو که از مهنت دیگران بیغمی نشاید که نامندند آدمی. Human being is of one limb. In case of pain for one of them, pain will go to all of them. In case you do not feel the pain of one, don't call yourself human being. I want to appreciate all of us. I include myself because of coming here. We care for all. And I don't want to talk about the Aboriginals because they are not present. But I'm studying them, I've been living with them, and I'm ashamed that we are talking of everyone and we are not talking of them. Thank you very much.
As you know, I appreciate the beautiful presentation. I've been following the series of presentations that have been happening here, and I thank the Master for having such a wonderful assortment of presentations. But today I was especially coming here because of Barbara, and I was in a place in my own life of giving up the social justice human right cause, and a little voice said, speak to Barbara, because maybe she could help inspire you, and today you did that, and I thank you for it. But beyond that, even today I had my challenges of getting up and coming to the social justice cause, dealing with poverty, and the miracle of nature, or the inspiration of heaven. I saw Ms. Pisano and figured microfinance and poverty, human rights, two of the great things that I loathe, answered in one visit. And I said, I'll come forward and I'll bring my friends with me to support me. I, once upon a time, made a mistake of running for the elections. I made a mistake once upon a time of leaving this beautiful college, university. McLaughlin was my school of college, and Mr. Pisano was my professor of criminology. And I went into my community and championed community work. And ultimately, poverty and social justice, the two devils of my life, beat the love out of me. And I'm almost in a place where I'm saying to you all in this room that we shouldn't give up. But we will give up if we are left alone. A year ago, I found myself in the darkest place, well, not the darkest, but the beginning of my darkness. And I decided I was going to take on agriculture. So imagine sitting down here and hearing this wonderful gentleman saying that he started his work in agriculture, and then the youth spirit of mobilizing the young people, because yes, they are the future, and we do have the capacity, but if only we could have bridged the gap between all of this, the miracle could happen. I don't know exactly what I'm trying to say to you all. I just thought it would be wrong of me not to say anything, because I too suffer for this very dual cause. And I don't know what more to say, but maybe if I didn't say anything, you won't know how important, how imperative, how miraculous the world would be if people like us didn't give up. Thank you.
That's really intimidating. Very well spoken. So I was actually discussing with the lovely lady in red. I'm sorry I didn't catch her name. It's funny that you brought up the deed thing and then you had asked a question about it. I'm from a really small town called Shawnigan Lake, BC, on Vancouver Island. And racism isn't something that's very much talked about, because outside of Aboriginal people, we don't have a very diverse group. So I moved to Toronto, which was a big culture shock. And I decided Toronto was too much for me, so I moved to Georgetown. And I wasn't aware of how overtly racist there was in Canada in their history. My very first experience in wanting to go into social justice was there was a farm across the road, and it had been a family farm. And the lady died, and it was been passed down. So we were looking at old deeds, and it actually said in the deed that no colored person was to own the property, and that the very first owner, if there was no other options and it was to go to a colored person, they'd rather it go to the church and be donated with no profit. So you had brought it up, and you had brought it up, so it's crazy. I can't even believe it. So I just thought I'd let you know. Thanks.
Well, this has really been quite a remarkable couple of hours for us. To try to summarize it in a couple of sentences would obviously fail, so I'm not going to summarize, but only mention a couple of the main messages I have taken away. I really appreciated Barbara's giving us a sense of how far we have come in 50 years. That's not to say we have finished the journey. There is a long way further to go. But we have come a long way. And as that very most recent illustration shows, we take for granted today things that were unthinkable a couple of generations ago. One wonders what we will take for granted 2 generations from now. And that's really the other thing that I've taken away from this discussion. We've been given conceptual and practical illustrations of another justice-seeking community within our country and our society that we have not yet resolved. If we knew everything that had to be done, we would have done it already, as the weight loss commercials on the radio say. But we have identified at least one of the next issues, and we have been shown very graphically how real that issue is. You all came today because you care about this set of issues, and that's encouraging about our collective ability to continue to make progress. So thank you to our speakers, thank you to all of you. In appreciation to our speakers, I would like to offer a priceless token of our appreciation. I say priceless because it is beyond price. It cannot be bought. It can only be bestowed in recognition of having given a talk at McLaughlin College. And so for Barbara, for Brenda, and for Lori. Now, the reason I am not giving one to Richard is because he already has one. And it is possible to get too much of a good thing. Richard gave a talk back in the fall semester and has already received one of these priceless items. And so all he gets is our thanks and nothing tangible. But thank you to all of you. Laura?
I would also like you to bear with me for a couple of minutes. I'm here on behalf of the School of Public Policy and Administration. And as you have heard, Barbara has a tremendous biography, but I'm here to talk about the relationship she has with our school. And as you've also heard, Barbara is leaving her term as commissioner, chief commissioner of the Ontario Human Rights Commission, and she's about to embark on new and I'm sure interesting challenges. And before she goes, on behalf of our school, I want to express our appreciation for her service, public service, and her leadership in the area of human rights. But most importantly, for her support and the Ontario Human Rights Commission's support of the School of Public Policy and Administration. Some of you may not know or may know because you look like a young crowd. She was one of our first guest speakers for our graduate program back in, I believe, 2007 when we inaugurated the program. She spoke at the Martin Thomas Annual Public Policy Lecture, and we truly appreciated that. That was followed up shortly thereafter by several professors in our school, along with graduate students participating in the CMART project. The CMART project is the Canadian Canadian Municipalities Against Racism and Discrimination Initiative. It's an international initiative begun by the United Nations and UNESCO, but we contributed to that as our York contingent in producing some a scan of international best practices for combating racism and discrimination for Canadian municipalities to use. And later on, of course, the Commission, along with Barbara and our President Sucre, launched the housing policy of the OHRC. And then we participated, our school, several professors, along with some students, in developing the competing rights policy that was launched here at York University by the OHRC and Barbara. Along with that policy, accompanying that policy, we actually produced a book called Balancing Competing Rights in a Diverse Society with supposedly the top human rights scholars in the country. And I was a part of that along with Les Jacobs and Dr. Shaheen Azmi, who's the director of public education and community outreach at the Ontario Human Rights Commission. We edited that book and we launched it here also at York University. And the Commission also has launched, some of you might remember, the new CREED policy, which is definitely needed here at York University. And some of us in the faculty are still continuing to work with and partner with the Ontario Human Rights Commission in the area of policing and human rights. Les Jacobs and myself and Professor Bobby Sue, who are with this school, we're now working with the Ottawa Police Services. You were speaking earlier about racial profiling. We're actually conducting the largest race data collection project that has been undertaken here in Canada with the Ottawa Police Services. We're also working with York Regional Police Services and the Windsor Police Services on the human rights and policing. And through all of that, Barbara Hall has been a great leader and a tremendous trailblazer. And for those reasons and for our partnership and connection, I would like to present her with this certificate of appreciation from the School of Public Policy and Administration.
You can do so much more when you work with other people, and this is an example of that, the things we've done together, and this is an honor. Thank you.
In closing, one can only scratch the surface of a huge topic like social justice and human rights. I wanted to just alert you to 4 upcoming talks in the next 2 or 3 weeks that we will be hosting that each deal with a different aspect of social justice and human rights. Next week, on Tuesday, here in this same room, one of our college fellows, Peter Dawson, will be speaking about Aboriginal issues, both in Canada and indigenous peoples in a number of other countries, especially in Central America. Later that week, on Thursday, we will have a presentation about energy efficiency in the healthcare sector in Ontario hospitals. We will celebrate International Women's Day on March the 5th, where the former president of York University, Lorna Marsden, former senator in the Canadian Senate, former head of the National Action Committee on the Status of Women, will be our keynote speaker about International Women's Day. And on March the 10th, Olivia Chow, former member of Parliament, former city councillor, and former candidate for mayor of Toronto, will be speaking about affordable childcare. No single session can capture this whole topic, but today's session captured enormously important parts of this topic, and thank you all for being part of it. Thank you.